When thinking of the First World War, it's almost certain that anyone would think of the torturous trench warfare of the Western Front, rats and disease plaguing the soldiers, no man's land devoid of life and full of fear. But not many Westerners think of the complicated geopolitics of the Caucasus, or proxy wars of the Ottoman Empire, or the constantly moving fronts in the Middle East. So, today we'll explore a different face of the Great War, as I tell you about the Turkish fronts of World War I. For a long time, Russia had been enemies of the Austro-Hungarians and Ottomans, and saw an opportunity to both weaken the empires and gain allies to the southwest in the tumultuous Balkans. The Russians used the guise of pan-Slavism to send aid to many Balkan peoples hoping for independence, which eventually led to the Balkan Wars, with many peoples bearing arms against the Ottomans. This was a strategic victory for Russia, as they now had several allies in the Balkans, who proved that they could hold their own against Russian enemies. And this brought the Russians closer to their underlying goal of taking the Bosphorus Strait, and having full control of Black Sea trade. The Russians had more expansionist claims near the Caucasus, as they claimed to protect the Christian Armenian population under Ottoman rule, which they could use as an excuse to annex more lands. The Russians were also very in favor of entering a large war, as they had just been militarily humiliated by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War to the east, and wanted to prove themselves as a European power. Now the Ottomans had recently gone through a violent revolution, and this was during one of the weakest points of the Ottoman Empire. So, after the loss of most of their Balkan territories, the goal of the empire was to strengthen their position within their borders. And so, to consolidate their power within their borders, they planned a Transcaucasian puppet state that would provide a buffer between the Russians and them. This Transcaucasian state could be run by the relatively large group of Muslim Caucasian peoples who objected to many Russian laws on the basis of their religion. The Ottoman Empire also had plans of expansionism, as the English had taken Egypt from the Ottoman sphere of influence and pulled it into theirs. The Ottomans wanted to regain these lands, and the lands lost to the Russian influence in the Balkans. Both Russia and the Ottoman Empire, seeing that this war between them was inevitable, the Ottomans requested an alliance with Germany. The Ottomans were enemies of the Austro-Hungarians, but they put that aside as the threat of the Russian Empire was more pressing, while supporting Muslim rebel groups in Russia by giving them arms and spreading anti-Russian propaganda. And the Russians, for their part, did their best in gaining the favor of many subgroups under the Ottomans, who said that they would support Russia if they advanced into Anatolia, while also supporting rebel groups in Turkish lands who were already in revolt. Both nations feared internal chaos, and began deporting many associated with the other empire and with dissent. Civilians were forcefully removed from their homes, and many were killed by their own state. The English and French both had interest in the Middle East, as the large oil reserves were very attractive to them, and they both saw the Ottoman people as subhuman, and felt that if the Ottoman Empire joined a larger war, their superior European might would steamroll them, adding new lands to these great empires in the peace deal. After the bombing of several Black Sea ports in southern Ukraine by the Ottoman fleet, Russia declared war on the Ottomans, bringing them into the Great War. As I said before, both Russia and the Ottoman Empire had goals in the Caucasus, and so, once the Ottomans joined the First World War, this region became a hotbed for conflict. Before this declaration of war, Russia had been struggling against the Germans on the Eastern Front, so many soldiers were moved from the Caucasus to this front, meaning the Russian army was very under-garrisoned in the region. But the Russians used surprise to their advantage, as they attacked swiftly without warning, catching the Ottomans off guard, routing them quickly enough for them not to be able to have a clear estimation of how many Russians were attacking, and to see their clear numerical advantage. As this was during the dead of winter, a significant number of Ottoman soldiers died of hypothermia during their retreat, further weakening the Ottoman position. The Russians were able to take a large amount of territory over a few days, but the Ottomans mounted a counteroffensive with new soldiers that had arrived at the front, and pushed the Russians back to their original border. But they didn't stop there. Emboldened by their recent victories, the Ottoman army pushed into Russian lands, and began their Persian offensive into Iran. This is because Iran, or as it was known at the time, Persia, was in the sphere of influence of both Britain and Russia, and both parties had troops stationed there. Soon, the Ottomans arrived at the Russian town of Sarikamish. However, here the Russians had entrenched themselves very well, and though they were outnumbered nearly 2-1, the Russians were able to fend off the Ottomans and send them on the retreat. The Russians didn't realize to what extent they had destroyed their enemy, and didn't push as deep as they could have, taking a more cautious advance than many others say they should have. Due to the victory in Sarikamish, the Russians were pushing back the Ottomans in Persia as well, and now the Caucasian front returned to its pre-war position, while the Ottomans still occupied some lands of Iran. This defeat and subsequent retreat was used by the Ottomans to scapegoat the Armenian population, claiming that they were the ones who undermined the Ottoman offensive. The Armenians would be targeted and systematically killed under the Ottomans in the Armenian genocide that followed. But this genocide only worsened the position of the Ottomans, as they had to divert a lot of resources and men to follow through with this killing. It also weakened supply lines, which were heavily fueled by the large Armenian population of the region. After a period of regrouping and a stillness along the front, the Russians surged forwards. The army attacking the Van province saw success and were able to secure land east of the Van Lake, and more importantly, push the Ottomans from Persia. The other army, trying to push towards Erzurum, was repelled, and once again, there was a relative stillness in the Caucasus, as the Russians focused on the eastern front, where they were consistently losing ground. But now, the Russians would advance mid-winter, catching the Ottomans off guard, who would have never expected an offensive in such bitter cold. The Russian army advanced all the way to the city of Erzurum and the major port city of Trabzon. These front lines stayed relatively stable for a long period of time, until the Russian Revolution sprang up. This sent the Caucasus into chaos, with many people declaring regional rule in the name of communism, and others taking advantage of this environment to declare independence. During the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Ottomans gained some lands, but this was very minimal, and the people of the Caucasus didn't recognize the treaty, forcing the Ottomans to advance into the region. At the time, Egypt was an English protectorate, and the Ottomans saw the importance of the Suez Canal as the primary route from England to its eastern colonies. And before any attacks occurred in the region, Germans snuck across the border and dug wells in the Sinai Peninsula for the Ottoman army to be able to march through the Sinai Desert, a route the English would certainly never expect. Eventually, once logistics had been figured out, the Ottomans advanced and made it to the Suez Canal relatively unopposed. But the English knew that the Ottomans were coming all along, due to scouting planes, and were able to mount a formidable defense using the deep and wide canal to their advantage. Once the Ottomans arrived, they were the ones caught off guard, with the enemy defenses so strong, and were sent on the retreat. The English did not advance though, leaving the Ottomans in control of the Sinai Peninsula. This meant that the Ottomans were able to raid the canal whenever they wanted. In spite of their inability to fully control the Suez, the Turks were able to effectively disrupt traffic through the canal for a time. The English recognized this threat and sought to weaken their enemy's position by sending raids out into the desert, targeting water reserves. The raiders destroyed wells and drained any water that they could find. This proved to be very successful, and now the Ottoman attack was limited to the northern coast, where water was readily available. The Ottomans would soon be pushed back to their original borders by the Commonwealth Army, and now England made preparations to advance north up the Palestinian coast. During this period, aerial bombings were frequent, as supply lines were so integral to each army, with water and other resources being so scarce. Now, the Ottomans were greatly weakened by the Arab revolt springing up. The Arab revolt was vitally supplied by the Entente powers, hoping that this revolt would weaken the Ottoman Empire to take swift victory over the nation. However, in spite of this internal disruption, the Palestinian front was only able to advance slightly, with Commonwealth forces attacking Gaza several times, but to no avail. The English, however, had a plan, and tricked the Ottomans into believing that they would attack Gaza once again. The Commonwealth army was truly planning an attack on the town of Beersheba, which would be lightly defended with the expectation of the Gazan target. Victory here was crucial, as elsewhere in the Middle East, the British were having trouble with the Ottomans. And so, in Palestine, the offensive had to be pushed, and it had to be pushed hard, so that the Ottomans had to redirect troops. Luckily for the British, this push was very successful. The deception worked. Gaza was eventually conquered, and the armies of the Commonwealth made it to the gates of Jerusalem. This was and is an immensely significant city to world history, and a holy site for many religions. So the British expected a long, drawn-out fight. To their surprise, once they arrived, the city surrendered, and the English forces found the city abandoned by the Ottoman army. From here, the British saw that the Ottomans were on their last legs, and so began an all-out offensive northwards to finish this part of the war once and for all. The men pushed hard, and the Arab population saw the weakened Ottoman Empire and fought with a new fervor. Eventually, the combined forces of the Commonwealth and Arab rebels fought together to take Aleppo. The crippling loss of the city led to the end of Ottoman involvement in the Great War. The British held many oil-rich Persian settlements, and so, as the Ottomans entered the Great War, the British feared for the safety of these holdings. Immediately, plans were made to invade the Mesopotamian region, which culminated in the Fao landings, where British Marines landed on the coast of the Persian Gulf to break the defenses at Fao Fort, at the mouth of the Tigris River. The Ottoman army had already been stretched thin, as they had fronts in the Caucasus, Palestine, and were fending off the landings at Gallipoli, so this new surprise front strained the army significantly. The weak defenses at Fao Fort allowed for an easy foothold for English soldiers. But this wasn't the end of the campaign, as further north lay the true objective, Basra, where the Ottoman army converged for a proper defense. The British troops advanced, supported by gunboats sailing up the river Tigris. Here, the Basra defenses crumbled and the objective was secured. The British never expected this ease of success, and so reconsidered halting their advance to entrench at the town. They now set their sights on the city of Baghdad, an immensely important Ottoman holding. The Ottomans recognized this and rushed to defend the route to the city. They were finally able to halt the seemingly unstoppable advance of the British at Ctesiphon, a mere 40 kilometers away from Baghdad. This was an absolutely terrifying defeat for the British, as troops could not reinforce the halved army of the Commonwealth. The British feared the worst, as they retreated and entrenched at the city of Kut. After a few failed attacks on Kut, some of the Ottoman army simply marched past the city to cut off the British from the south, and due to this, a relief force was nowhere in sight for the besieged British. So what the British tried to do was break through the siege to retreat, but attempt after attempt would fail. Now, the army had to admit to themselves that at this point, they could not break through, and reinforcements were not coming. A grave decision had to be made, and the army at Kut surrendered. This was humiliating, as the British saw the Turk and Arab people as inferior, and they would not let this defeat stand. Another army was mustered and trained, and logistics were better planned than the somewhat spontaneous push past Basra. This time, they were able to force the Ottoman army back all the way to and past Baghdad. The city was now in the hands of the British, which increased army morale and sent the Ottomans running. Due to this string of losses, the Ottomans were forced to pull back from their attacks in Persia, and regrouped at Mosul, another majorly important city. The Commonwealth forces took the victory at Baghdad with pride, but exhaustion, from the series of battles it took to get there. Their advance was called off for a while, and the soldiers took a moment of rest. And as the army in Mesopotamia advanced, their front line joined with that of the Palestinian army, as they now marched north together. This march ended with the capture of Mosul, and the Ottoman army signed an armistice, sparing the heartland of Anatolia from further horrors of war. And that is the Turkish fronts of World War I highlighted.